at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is the Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. All right, there's a problem with the Blog Talk Radio host call-in. So I'm just going strictly doing the YouTube broadcast this evening. All right, so today's the first day of October, year of our Lord, 2019. And the topic, I concluded the other day. Wrapped up my discussion on leading human resources. Okay, so now, I'm gonna switch gears and I'm gonna start talking about public relations. And so it's a little mashup. Again, the first half of the show, I'm gonna be channeling the spirit of Alfred Marshall. Well, maybe not me, but we're gonna be using a team of crack mediums. We'll be channeling the spirit of Alfred Marshall. We're gonna have a little seance. He's gonna talk about his principles of economics. While that's going on, once again, I'm gonna be doing the motivational, inspirational, 50-year-old cripple guy instructional fitness video. And so once again, I'm just gonna use a really lightweight 10-pound therapeutic bar. Just I don't know, keep it going for 45, 50 minutes. Get the blood flowing a little bit. And then the second half, I'm going to close the seance with Alfred Marshall and send him back to hell where he belongs, an economist hell. Okay, I'm just joking. I don't really know anything about his personal life. So I guess I should look into that, shouldn't I? Sure, I should. I should do a whole show on Alfred Marshall. Maybe I will. Damn it. Okay, but anyway, I'm going to come back and I'm going to be talking. Basically, I'm just going to be. I did an analysis of this book that I read. The Practice of Public Relations, and I put it all on my blog, which is charleslamson.blogspot.com. Go check it out. And if you're into podcasts as well, you can go to blogtalkradio.com/Charles Lamson. Got tons and tons of stuff going back to 2010. 2010. So it's I was doing a lot of really wacky shows back then. But so I don't know if the show has evolved since then or devolved or what, but it's still going. Damn it, it's changed definitely. So anyway, I'm going to be talking, second half, I'm going to be talking about public relations. And so it's a little mashup of what, I like to call public relations, an economic perspective. I'm going to tie the two topics, Alfred Marshall's economics with, what's that guy's name? Fraser P. Seidel's the practice of public relations. Or tie it all together somehow. You'll see. It'll all fit hand in glove. All right. So that being said, let's get this shindig started. Alfred, are you there? Please share with us your principles of economics.
Of employment for manual labour in a few trades, yet on the whole, it will very much increase the demand for manual labour and all other agents of production, for it will much increase the national dividend, which is the common source of the demand for all. And since by its increased competition for employment, it will have forced down the rate of interest, therefore, the joint product of a dose of capital and labour will now be divided more in favour of the labour than before. This new demand for labour will partly take the form of the opening out of new undertakings, which hitherto could not have paid their way, while a new demand will come from the makers of new and more expensive machinery. For when it is said that machinery is substituted for labour, this means that one class of labour, combined with much weighting, is substituted for another combined with less weighting. And for this reason alone, it would be impossible to substitute capital for labour in general, except indeed locally, by the importation of capital from other places. It remains true, however, that the chief benefit which an increase of capital confers upon labour is not by opening out to it new employments, but by increasing the joint product of land, labour and capital, or of land, labour and weighting, and by reducing the share of that product which any given amount of capital or of weighting can claim as its reward. Section 5. In discussing the influence which a change in the supply of work of any one industrial group exerts on the field of employment for other kinds of labour, there was no need to raise the question whether the increase of work came from an increase in the numbers or in the efficiency of those in the group, for that question is of no direct concern to the others. In either case, there is the same addition to the national dividend. In either case, competition will compel them to force themselves to the same extent into uses in which their marginal utility is lower, and will thus lessen to the same extent the share of the joint product which they are able to claim in return for a given amount of work of a given kind. But the question is of vital importance to the members of that group, for if the change is an increase of 1/10 in their average efficiency, then each 10 of them will have as high an aggregate income as each 11 of them would have if their numbers had increased by 1/10, their efficiency remaining unchanged. Footnote. Suppose, for instance, that an increase in the supply of work of the group by 1/10 forced them into work in which their marginal uses were lower, and thus lowered by a 13th their wages for any given amount of work. Then, if the change came from an increase in their numbers, their average wages would fall by a 13th. But if it came from an increase in their efficiency, their wages would rise by about a 16th. More exactly, they would be 11/10 multiplied by 29/30 equals 1 19/300 of what they were before. End footnote. This dependence of the wages of each group of workers on the numbers and efficiency of others is a special case of the general rule that the environment, or conjuncture, plays a part at least coordinate with a man's energy and ability in governing that net product to which his wages ever approximate under the influence of competition. The net product to which the normal wages of any group of workers approximate must be estimated on the assumption that production has been pushed to that limit at which the output can be just marketed with normal profits, but not more, and it must be estimated with reference to a worker of normal efficiency, whose additional output repays an employer of normal ability and normal good fortune and normal resources with normal profits, but not more. Something must be added to or subtracted from this net product to find the normal wages of a worker whose efficiency is more or less than normal. The time chosen must be one of normal prosperity, and when the supplies of different kinds of labour are relatively appropriate. For instance, if the building trade is exceptionally depressed or exceptionally prosperous, or if its development is checked by an inadequate supply of bricklayers or carpenters, while the supply of other classes of building operatives is superabundant, then the occasion is one which does not afford a convenient opportunity for estimating the relations of net product to normal wages of either bricklayers or carpenters. Footnote. As regards the relation between wages and the marginal net product of labour, see Book 6, Chapters 1 and 2. The matter is further discussed in Book 6, Chapter 13. As regards the need to seek a truly representative margin, see Book 5, Chapter 8, where it is argued that when that has been reached, the influence of the supply of any group of workers on the wages of others has already been reckoned, and that the influence which any one individual worker exerts on the general economic environment of the industries of a country is infinitesimal and is not relevant to an estimate of his net product in relation to his wages. In Book 5, Chapter 12 and Appendix H, something is said of the hindrances to a rapid increase of output, even where such an increase would theoretically yield great economies, and of the special care needed in the use of the term margin in regard to them. End footnote. End of Chapter 11.
Uh-oh. Very good. Dead air. Not good.
of Economics, Book 6.
Okay.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. Principles of Economics, Book 6, by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 12, General Influences of Economic Progress. The field of employment which any place offers for labour and capital depends firstly on its natural resources, secondly on the power of turning them to good account derived from its progress of knowledge and social and industrial organisation, and thirdly on the access that it has to markets in which it can sell those things of which it has a superfluity. The importance of this last condition is often underrated, but it stands out prominently when we look at the history of new countries. It is commonly said that wherever there is abundance of good land to be had free of rent, and the climate is not unhealthy, the real earnings of labour and the interest on capital must both be high. But this is only partially true. The early colonists of America lived very hardly. Nature gave them wood and meat almost free, but they had very few of the comforts and luxuries of life. And even now there are, especially in South America and Africa, many places to which nature has been abundantly generous, which are nevertheless shunned by labour and capital, because they have no communications with the rest of the world. On the other hand, high rewards may be offered to capital and labour by a mining district in the midst of an alkaline desert, when once communications have been opened up with the outer world, or again by a trading centre on a barren sea coast, though if limited to their own resources, they could support but a scanty population, and that in abject poverty. And the splendid markets which the old world has offered to the products of the new, since the growth of steam communication, have rendered North America, Australia, and parts of Africa and South America the richest large fields for the employment of capital and labour that there have ever been. But after all, the chief cause of the modern prosperity of new countries lies in the markets that the old world offers, not for goods delivered on the spot, but for promises to deliver goods at a distant date. A handful of colonists having assumed rights of perpetual property in vast tracts of rich land are anxious to reap in their own generation its future fruits, and as they cannot do this directly, they do it indirectly, by selling, in return for the ready goods of the old world, promises to pay much larger quantities of the goods that their own soil will produce in a future generation. In one form or another, they mortgage their new property to the old world at a very high rate of interest. Englishmen and others who have accumulated the means of present enjoyment hasten to barter them for larger promises in the future than they can get at home. A vast stream of capital flows to the new country, and its arrival there raises the rate of wages very high. The new capital filters but slowly towards the outlying districts. It is so scarce there, and there are so many persons eager to have it, that it often commands for a long time 2% a month, from which it falls by gradual stages down to 6 or perhaps even 5% a year. For the settlers, being full of enterprise and seeing their way to acquiring private title deeds to property that will shortly be of great value, are eager to become independent undertakers and, if possible, employers of others. So wage earners have to be attracted by high wages, which are paid in a great measure out of the commodities borrowed from the old world on mortgages or in other ways. It is, however, difficult to estimate exactly the real rate of wages in outlying parts of new countries. The workers are picked men with a natural bias towards adventure, hardy, resolute, and enterprising, men in the prime of life who do not know what illness is, and the strain of one kind and another which they go through is more than the average English and much more than the average European labourer could sustain. There are no poor among them because there are none who are weak. If anyone becomes ailing, he is forced to retire to some more thickly peopled place, where there is less to be earned, but where also a quieter and less straining life is possible. Their earnings are very high if reckoned in money, but they have to buy at very high prices or altogether dispense with many of the comforts and luxuries which they would have obtained freely or at low prices if they had lived in more settled places. Many of these things, however, meet only artificial wants, and they can be easily forgone where no one has them and no one expects them. As population increases, the best situations being already occupied, nature gives generally less return of raw produce to the marginal effort of the cultivators, and this tends a little to lower wages. But even in agriculture, the law of increasing return is constantly contending with that of diminishing return, and many of the lands which were neglected at first give a generous response to careful cultivation, and meanwhile the development of roads and railroads, and the growth of varied markets and varied industries render possible innumerable economies in production. Thus the tendencies to increasing and diminishing return appear pretty well balanced, sometimes the one, sometimes the other being the stronger. If labour and capital increase at equal rates, and if, taking one thing with another, the law of production is that of constant return, there will be no change in the reward to be divided between a dose of capital and labour, that is, between capital and labour working together in the same proportions as before. There need not, therefore, be any change in wages or interest. If, however, capital increases much faster than labour, the rate of interest is likely to fall, and then the rate of wages will probably rise at the expense of the share of a given quantum of capital. But yet the aggregate share of capital may increase faster than the aggregate share of labour. But whether the law of production of commodities be one of constant return or not, that of the production of new title deeds to land is one of rapidly diminishing return. The influx of foreign capital, though perhaps as great as ever, becomes less in proportion to the population. Wages are no longer paid largely with commodities borrowed from the old world, and this is the chief reason of the subsequent fall in the necessaries, comforts, and luxuries of life, which can be earned by work of a given efficiency. But two other causes tend to lower average daily wages measured in money. For as the comforts and luxuries of civilization increase, the average efficiency of labour is generally lowered by the influx of immigrants of a less sturdy character than the earliest settlers, and many of these new comforts and luxuries do not enter directly into money wages, but are an addition to it. Footnote. We took account of them when arriving at the conclusion that the tendency to increasing return would, on the whole, countervail that to diminishing return, and we ought to count them in at their full value when tracing the changes in real wages. Many historians have compared wages at different epochs with exclusive reference to those things which have always been in common consumption. But from the nature of the case, these are just the things to which the law of diminishing return applies, and which tend to become scarce as population increases, and the view thus got is therefore one-sided and misleading in its general effect. End of footnote. England's present economic condition is the direct result of tendencies to production on a large scale and to wholesale dealings in labour as well as in goods, which had long been slowly growing, but which in the 18th century received a twofold impetus from mechanical inventions and the growth of consumers beyond the seas, who imported large quantities of goods of the same pattern. Then were the first beginnings of machine-made interchangeable parts, and the application of special machinery to make special machinery for use in every branch of industry. Then first was seen the full force which the law of increasing return gives in a manufacturing country with localized industries and large capitals, particularly when many of the large stocks of capital are combined together, either into joint stock or regulated companies, or into modern trusts. And then began that careful grading of goods for sale in distant markets, which has already led to national and even international speculative combinations in produce markets and stock exchanges, and the future of which, no less than that of more lasting combinations among producers, whether undertakers of industry or working men, is the source of some of the gravest practical problems with which the coming generation will have to deal. The keynotes of the modern movement are the reduction of a great number of tasks to one pattern, the diminution of friction of every kind which might hinder powerful agencies from combining their action and spreading their influence over vast areas, and the development of transport by new methods and new forces. The macadamized roads and the improved shipping of the 18th century broke up local combinations and monopolies and offered facilities for the growth of others extending over a wider area. And in our own age, the same double tendency is resulting from every new extension and cheapening of communication by land and sea, by printing press and telegraph and telephone. But though in the 18th century, as now, the real national dividend of England depended much on the action of the law of increasing return with regard to her exports, the mode of dependence has very much changed. Then England had something approaching to a monopoly of the new methods of manufacture, and each bale of her goods would be sold, at all events when their supply was artificially limited, in return to a vast amount of the produce of foreign countries. But, partly because the time was not yet ripe for carrying bulky goods great distances, her imports from the Far East and Far West consisted chiefly of comforts and luxuries for the well-to-do. They had but little direct effect in lowering the labour cost of necessaries to the English workman. Indirectly, indeed, her new trade lowered the cost of hardware, clothing, and such other English manufactures as he consumed, because the production on a large scale of these things for consumers beyond the sea cheapened them for him. But it had very little effect on the cost of his food, and that was left to rise under the tendency to diminishing return, which was called into action by the rapid increase of population in new manufacturing districts where the old customary restraints of a narrow village life did not exist. A little later, the Great French War and a series of bad harvests raised that cost to much the highest point it has ever reached in Europe. But gradually the influence of foreign trade began to tell on the cost of production of our staple food. As the population of America spread westward from the Atlantic, richer and still richer wheat soils have come under cultivation, and the economies of transport have increased so much, especially in recent years, that the total cost of importing a quarter of wheat from the farms on the outskirts of cultivation has diminished rapidly, though the distance of that margin has been increasing. And thus, England has been saved from the need of more and more intensive cultivation. The bleak hillsides up which the wheat fields were laboriously climbing in Ricardo's time have returned to pasture, and the ploughman works now only where land will yield plentiful returns to his labour, whereas if England had been limited to her own resources, he must have plodded over ever poorer and poorer soils, and must have gone on continually reploughing land that had already been well ploughed, in the hope of adding by this heavy toil an extra bushel or two to the produce of each acre. Perhaps in an average year now, the ploughing which only just pays its expenses, the ploughing on the margin of cultivation, gives twice as much produce as it gave in Ricardo's time, and fully 5 times as much as it would have given now if with her present population England had been compelled to raise all her own food. Every improvement in the manufacturing arts increased England's power of meeting the various wants of backward countries, so that it answered their purpose to divert their energy from making things by hand for their own use to growing raw material with which to buy manufactures from her. In this way, the progress of invention opened a wider field for the sale of her special products, and enabled her more and more to confine her own production of food to conditions under which the law of diminishing return did not make itself much felt. But this good fortune has been short-lived. Her improvements have been followed, and latterly often anticipated, by America and Germany and other countries, and her special products have lost nearly all their monopoly value. Thus, the amount of food and other raw material which can be bought in America with a ton of steel cannot be more than the produce of as much capital and labour as would make a ton of steel there by the new processes, and therefore it has fallen as the efficiency of English and American labour in making steel has increased. It is for this reason, as well as because of the heavy tariffs levied on her goods by many countries, that in spite of England's large trade, the progress of invention in the manufacturing arts has added less than might have been otherwise expected to her real national dividend. It is no slight gain that she can make cheaply clothes and furniture and other commodities for her own use, but those improvements in the arts of manufacture which she has shared with other nations have not directly increased the amount of raw produce which she can obtain from other countries with the product of a given quantity of her own capital and labour. Probably more than 3/4 of the whole benefit she has derived from the progress of manufactures during the 19th century has been through its indirect influences in lowering the cost of transport of men and goods, of water and light, and of electricity and news. For the dominant economic fact of our own age is the development not of the manufacturing, but of the transport industries. It is these that are growing most rapidly in aggregate volume and in individual power, and which are giving rise to the most anxious questions as to the tendencies of large capitals to turn the forces of economic freedom to the destruction of that freedom. But on the other hand, it is they also which have done by far the most towards increasing England's wealth. Thus, the new economic age has brought with it great changes in the relative values of labour and the chief requisites of life, and many of these changes are of a character which could not have been anticipated at the beginning of last century. The America then known was ill-suited for growing wheat, and the cost of carrying it great distances by land was prohibitive. The labour value of wheat, that is, the amount of labour which will purchase a peck of wheat, was then at its highest point, and now is at its lowest. It would appear that agricultural wages have been generally below a peck of wheat a day, but that in the first half of the 18th century they were about a peck, in the 15th a peck and a half, or perhaps a little more, while now they are 2 or 3 pecks. Professor Rogers's estimates for the Middle Ages are higher, but he seems to have taken the wages of the more favoured part of the population as representative of the whole. In the Middle Ages, even after a fairly good harvest, the wheat was of a lower quality than the ordinary wheat of today, while after a bad harvest, much of it was so musty that nowadays it would not be eaten at all, and the wheat seldom became bread without paying a high monopoly charge to the mill belonging to the lord of the manor. It is true that where population is very sparse, nature supplies grass, and therefore animal food, almost gratis, and in South America beggars pursue their calling on horseback. During the Middle Ages, however, the population of England was always dense enough to give a considerable labour value to meat, though it was of poor quality. For cattle, though only about 1/5 as heavy as now, had very large frames. Their flesh was chiefly in those parts from which the coarsest joints come, and since they were nearly starved in the winter, and fed up quickly on the summer grass, the meat contained a large percentage of water, and lost a great part of its weight in cooking. At the end of the summer they were slaughtered and salt was dear. Even the well-to-do scarcely tasted fresh meat during the winter. A century ago, very little meat was eaten by the working classes, while now, though its price is a little higher than it was then, they probably consume more of it on the average than at any other time in English history. Turning next to the rent of house room, we find that ground rents in town have risen both extensively and intensively. For an increasing part of the population is living in houses on which ground rents at an urban scale have to be paid, and that scale is rising. But house rent proper, that is what remains of the total rent after deducting the full rental value of the ground, is probably little, if at all, higher than at any previous time for similar accommodation. For the rate of profits on the turnover which is earned by capital engaged in building is now low, and the labour cost of building materials has not much altered. And it must be remembered that those who pay the high town rents get in return the amusements and other advantages of modern town life, which many of them would not be willing to forgo for the sake of a much greater gain than their total rent. The labour value of wood, though lower than at the beginning of the century, is higher than in the Middle Ages, but that of mud, brick, or stone walls has not much changed, while that iron, to say nothing of glass, has fallen much. And indeed, the popular belief that house rent proper has risen appears to be due to an imperfect acquaintance with the way in which our forefathers were really housed. The modern suburban artisan's cottage contained sleeping accommodation far superior to that of the gentry in the Middle Ages, and the working classes had then no other beds than loose straw reeking with vermin and resting on damp mud floors. Even these were probably less unwholesome when bare and shared between human beings and livestock than when an attempt at respectability covered them with rushes, which were nearly always vile with long accumulated refuse. But it is undeniable that the housing of the very poorest classes in our towns now is destructive, both of body and soul, and that with our present knowledge and resources we have neither cause nor excuse for allowing it to continue. Footnote. The evils of the past were, however, greater than is commonly supposed. See, for example, the striking evidence of the late Lord Shaftesbury and of Miss Octavia Hill upon the Commission on Housing of 1885. London air is full of smoke, but it is probably less unwholesome than it was before the days of scientific sanitation, even though the population was then relatively small. End of footnote. Fuel, like grass, is often a free gift of nature to a sparse population, and during the Middle Ages the cottagers could generally, though not always, get the little brushwood fire needed to keep them warm as they huddled together round it in huts which had no chimney through which the heat could go to waste. But as population increased, the scarcity of fuel pressed heavily on the working classes, and would have arrested England's progress altogether, had not coal been ready to take the place of wood as fuel for domestic purposes as well as for smelting iron. It is now so cheap that even the comparatively poor can keep themselves warm indoors without living in an unwholesome and stupefying atmosphere. This is one of the great services that coal has wrought for modern civilization. Another is to provide cheap underclothing, without which cleanliness is impossible for the masses of the people in a cold climate, and that is perhaps the chief of the benefits that England has gained from the direct application of machinery to making commodities for her own use. Another, and not less important service, is to provide abundant water, even in large towns, and another to supply, with the aid of mineral oil, that cheap and artificial light which is needed not only for some of man's work, but, what is of higher moment, for the good use of his evening leisure. Footnote to abundant water even in large towns. Primitive appliances will bring water from high ground to a few public fountains, but the omnipresent water supply which, both in its coming and in its going, performs essential services for cleanliness and sanitation, would be impossible without coal-driven steam pumps and coal-made iron pipes. End of footnote. To this group of requisites for a civilized life, derived from coal on the one hand and modern means of transport on the other, we must add, as has just been noticed, the cheap and thorough means of communication of news and thought by steam presses, by steam-carried letters, and steam-made facilities for travel. These agencies, aided by electricity, are rendering possible the civilization of the masses in countries the climate of which is not so warm as to be enervating, and are preparing the way for true self-government and united action by the whole people, not merely of a town such as Athens, Florence, or Bruges, but a broad country, and even in some respects of the whole civilized world. We have seen that the national dividend is at once the aggregate net product of and the sole source of payment for all the agents of production within the country, that the larger it is, the larger, other things being equal, will be the share of each agent of production, and that an increase in the supply of any agent will generally lower its price to the benefit of other agents. This general principle is specially applicable to the case of land. An increase of the amount of productiveness of the land that supplies any market redounds in the first instance to the benefit of those capitalists and workers who are in possession of other agents of production for the same market. And the influence on values which has been exerted in the modern age by the new means of transport is nowhere so conspicuous as in the history of land. Its value rises with every improvement in its communications with markets in which its produce can be sold, and its value falls with every new access to its own markets of produce from more distant places. It is not very long ago that the home counties were full of fears that the making of good roads would enable the more distant parts of England to compete with them in supplying London with food. And now the differential advantages of English farms are in some respects being lowered by the importation of food that has travelled on Indian and American railroads and been carried in ships made of steel and driven by steam turbines. But, as Malthus contended and Ricardo admitted, anything that promotes the prosperity of the people promotes also in the long run that of the landlords of the soil. It is true that English rents rose very fast when, at the beginning of last century, a series of bad harvests struck down a people that could not import their food. But a rise so caused could not, from the nature of the case, have gone very much further. And the adoption of free trade in corn in the middle of the century, followed by the expansion of American wheat fields, is rapidly raising the real value of the land, urban and rural, taken together. That is, it is raising the amount of the necessaries, comforts and luxuries of life which can be purchased by the aggregate rental of all the landowners, urban and rural, taken together. Footnote. Mr. W. Sturge, in an instructive paper read before the Institute of Surveyors, December 1872, estimates that the agricultural money rent of England doubled between 1795 and 1815, and then fell by a third until 1822. After that time, it has been alternately rising and falling, and it is now about 45 or 50 millions, as against 50 or 55 millions about the year 1873, when it was at its highest. It was about 30 millions in 1810, 16 millions in 1770, and 6 millions in 1600. Compare Giffen's Growth of Capital, Chapter 5, and Porter's Progress of the Nation, Section 2, Chapter 1. But the rental of urban land in England is now much greater than the rent of agricultural land, and in order to estimate the full gain of the landlords from the expansion of population and general progress, we must reckon in the values of the land on which there are now railroads, mines, docks, etc. Taken altogether, the money rental of England's soil is more than twice as high, and its real rental is perhaps 4 times as high as it was when the Corn Laws were repealed. End of footnote. But, though the development of the industrial environment tends on the whole to raise the value of land, it more often than not lessens the value of machinery and other kinds of fixed capital, insofar as their value can be separated from that of the sites on which they rest. A sudden burst of prosperity may indeed enable the existing stock of appliances in any trade to earn for a time a very high income. But things which can be multiplied without limit cannot retain for long a scarcity value, and if they are fairly durable, blast furnaces and textile machinery, they are likely to suffer great depreciation from the rapid progress of improvement. The value of such things as railways and docks, however, depends in the long run chiefly on their situation. If that is good, the progress of their industrial environment will raise their net value even after allowance has been made for the charges to which they may be put in keeping their appliances abreast of the age. Footnote. Of course, there are exceptions. Economic progress may take the form of building new railways that will draw off much of the traffic of some of those already existing, or of increasing the size of ships till they can no longer enter docks, the entrance to which is through shallow waters. End of footnote. Political arithmetic may be said to have begun in England in the 17th century, and from that time onwards, we find a constant and nearly steady increase in the amount of accumulated wealth per head of the population. Man, though still somewhat impatient of delay, has gradually become more willing to sacrifice ease or other enjoyment in order to obtain them in the future. He has acquired a greater telescopic faculty, that is, he has acquired an increased power of realizing the future and bringing it clearly before his mind's eye. He is more prudent and has more self-control, and is therefore more inclined to estimate at a high rate future ills and benefits, these terms being used broadly to include the highest and lowest affections of the human mind. He is more unselfish and therefore more inclined to work and save in order to secure a future provision for his family, and there are already faint signs of a brighter time to come, in which there will be a general willingness to work and save in order to increase the stores of public wealth and of public opportunities for leading a higher life. But, though he is more willing than in earlier ages to incur present ills for the sake of future benefits, it is doubtful whether we can now trace a continued increase in the amount of exertion which he is willing to undergo for the sake of obtaining positive pleasures for the present or future. During many generations, the industry of the Western world has steadily become more sedulous. Holidays have diminished, the hours of work have increased, and people have, from choice or necessity, contented themselves with less and less search for pleasure outside their work. But it would seem that this movement has reached its maximum and is now declining. In all grades of work except the very highest, People are getting to prize relaxation more highly than before, and are becoming more impatient of the fatigue that results from excessive strain, and they are perhaps on the whole less willing than they used to be to undergo the constantly increasing discommodity of very long hours of work for the sake of obtaining present luxuries. These causes would make them less willing than before to work hard in order to provide against distant needs, were it not that there is an even more rapid increase in their power of realizing the future, and perhaps, though this is more doubtful, in their desire for that social distinction which comes from the possession of some small store of accumulated wealth. This increase of capital per head tended to diminish its marginal utility, and therefore the rate of interest on new investments fell, though not uniformly. It was reported to be 10% during a great part of the Middle Ages, but it fell to 3% in the earlier half of the 18th century. The subsequent vast industrial and political demand for capital raised it again, and it was relatively high during the Great War. It fell when the political drain had ceased, the gold supply being at that time very small, but it rose in the third quarter of last century when new gold abounded, and capital was much needed for railways and the development of new countries. After 1873, an era of peace, combined with the slackening of the gold supply, lowered interest. But now it is rising again, partly in consequence of an increased gold supply. The growth of general enlightenment and of a sense of responsibility towards the young has turned a great deal of the increasing wealth of the nation from investment as material capital to investment as personal capital. There has resulted a largely increased supply of trained abilities, which has much increased the national dividend and raised the average income of the whole people, but it has taken away from these trained abilities much of that scarcity value which they used to possess, and has lowered their earnings, not indeed absolutely, but relatively to the general advance, and it has caused many occupations which not long ago were accounted skilled, and which are still spoken of as skilled, to rank with unskilled labour as regards wages. A striking instance is that of writing. It is true that many kinds of office work require a rare combination of high mental and moral qualities, but almost anyone can be easily taught to do the work of a copying clerk, and probably there will soon be few men or women in England who cannot write fairly well. When all can write, the work of copying, which used to earn higher wages than almost any kind of manual labour, will rank among unskilled trades. In fact, the better kinds of artisan work educate a man more, and will be better paid than those kind of clerk's work which call for neither judgment nor responsibility. And as a rule, the best thing that an artisan can do for his son is to bring him up to do thoroughly the work that lies at his hand, so that he may understand the mechanical, chemical, or other scientific principles that bear upon it, and may enter into the spirit of any new improvement that may be made in it. If his son should prove to have good natural abilities, he is far more likely to rise to a high position in the world from the bench of an artisan than from the desk of a clerk. Again, a new branch of industry is often difficult simply because it is unfamiliar, and men of great force and skill are required to do work which can be done by men of ordinary capacity, or even by women and children when the track has once been well beaten. Its wages are high at first, but they fall as it becomes familiar. And this has caused the rise of average wages to be underrated, because it so happens that many of the statistics, which seem typical of general movements of wages, are taken from trades which were comparatively new a generation or two ago, and are now within the grasp of men of much less real ability than those who pioneered the way for them. Footnote: as the trade progresses, improvements in machinery are sure to lighten the strain of accomplishing any given task, and therefore to lower task wages rapidly. But meanwhile, the pace of the machinery and the quantity of it put under the charge of each worker may be increased so much that the total strain involved in the day's work is greater than before. On this subject, employers and employed frequently differ. It is, for instance, certain that time wages have risen in the textile trades, but the employees aver, in contradiction to the employers, that the strain imposed on them has increased more than in proportion. In this controversy, wages have been estimated in money, but when account is taken of the increase in the purchasing power of money, there is no doubt that real efficiency wages have risen. That is, the exertion of a given amount of strength, skill, and energy is rewarded by a greater command over commodities than formerly. End of footnote. The consequence of such changes as these is to increase the number of those employed in occupations which are called skilled, whether the term is now properly applied or not, and this constant increase in the numbers of workers in the higher classes of trades has caused the average of all labour to rise much faster than the average of representative wages in each trade. Footnote. This may be made clearer by an example. If there are 500 men in grade A earning 12 shillings a week, 400 in grade B earning 25 shillings, and 100 in grade C earning 40 shillings, the average wages of the 1,000 men are 20 shillings. If after a time 300 from grade A have passed on to grade B, and 300 from grade B to grade C, the wages in each grade remaining stationary, then the average wages of the whole 1,000 men will be about 28 shillings and sixpence. And even if the rate of wages in each grade had meanwhile fallen 10%, the average wages of all would still be about 25 shillings and sixpence. That is, would have risen more than 25%. Neglect of such facts as these, as Sir R. Giffen has pointed out, is apt to cause great errors. End of footnote. In the Middle Ages, though some men of great ability remained artisans all their lives and became artists, yet as a class the artisans ranked more nearly with the unskilled labourers than they do now. At the beginning of the new industrial era in the middle of the 18th century, the artisans had lost much of their old artistic traditions and had not yet acquired that technical command over their instruments, that certainty and facility in the exact performance of difficult tasks which belonged to the modern skilled artisan. A change set in early last century, and observers were struck by the social gulf that was opening out between skilled and unskilled labour, and the rise of the wages of the artisan to about double those of ordinary labour. For indeed, the great increase in the demand for highly skilled labour, especially in the metal trades, stimulated a rapid absorption of the strongest characters among the labourers and their children into the ranks of the artisans. The breaking down just at that time of the old exclusiveness of the artisans was making them less than before an aristocracy by birth, and more than before an aristocracy by worth, and this rise in the quality of artisans enabled them to maintain a rate of wages much above that of ordinary labour for a long while. But gradually some of the simpler forms of skilled trades began to lose their scarcity value as their novelty wore off, and at the same time continually increasing demands began to be made on the ability of those in some trades that were traditionally ranked as unskilled. The navvy, for instance, and the agricultural labourer have been increasingly trusted with expensive and complicated machinery, which had been thought to belong only to the skilled trades, and the real wages of those two representative occupations has risen fast. The rise of wages of agricultural labourers would be more striking than it is, did not the spread of modern notions to agricultural districts cause many of the ablest children born there to leave the fields for the railway or the workshop, to become policemen or to act as carters or porters in towns. Those who are left behind in the fields have received a better education than was to be had in earlier times, and though having perhaps less than an average share of natural ability, they earn much higher real wages than their fathers. There are some skilled and responsible occupations, such as those of the head heaters and rollers in ironworks, which require great physical strength and involve much discomfort, and in them wages are very high. For the temper of the age makes those who can do high-class work and can earn good wages easily refuse to undergo hardship except for a very high reward. We may next consider the changes in the relative wages of old and young men, of women and children. The conditions of industry change so fast that long experience is in some trades almost a disadvantage, and in many it is of far less value than a quickness in taking hold of new ideas and adapting one's habits to new conditions. A man is likely to earn less after he is 50 years old than before he is 30, and the knowledge of this is tempting artisans to follow the example of unskilled labourers, whose natural inclination to marry early has always been encouraged by the desire that their family expenses may begin to fall off before their own wages begin to shrink. A second and even more injurious tendency of the same kind is that of the wages of children to rise relatively to those of their parents. Machinery has displaced many men, but not many boys. The customary restrictions which excluded them from some trades are giving way, and these changes, together with the spread of education, while doing good in almost every other direction, are doing harm in this, that they are enabling boys, and even girls, to set their parents at defiance and start in life on their own account. The wages of women are for similar reasons rising fast relatively to those of men, and this is a great gain insofar as it tends to develop their faculties, but an injury insofar as it tempts them to neglect their duty of building up a true home and of investing their efforts in the personal capital of their children's character and abilities. The relative fall in the incomes to be earned by moderate ability, however carefully trained, is accentuated by the rise in those that are obtained by many men of extraordinary ability. There never was a time at which moderately good oil paintings sold more cheaply than now, and there never was a time at which first-rate paintings sold so dearly. A businessman of average ability and average good fortune now gets a lower rate of profits on his capital than at any previous time, while yet the operations in which a man exceptionally favoured by genius and good luck can take part are so extensive as to enable him to amass a huge fortune with a rapidity hitherto unknown. The causes of this change are chiefly two. Firstly, the general growth of wealth, and secondly, the development of new facilities for communication, by which men who have once attained a commanding position are enabled to apply their constructive or speculative genius to undertakings vaster and extending over a wider area than ever before. It is the first cause almost alone that enables some barristers to command very high fees, for a rich client whose reputation or fortune or both are at stake will scarcely count any price too high to secure the services of the best man he can get. And it is this again that enables jockeys and painters and musicians of exceptional ability to get very high prices. In all these occupations, the highest incomes earned in our own generation are the highest that the world has yet seen. But so long as the number of persons who can be reached by a human voice is strictly limited, it is not very likely that any singer will make an advance on the £10,000 said to have been earned in a season by Mrs. Billington at the beginning of last century, nearly as great as that which the business leaders of the present generation have made on those of the last. For the two causes have cooperated to put enormous power and wealth in the hands of those businessmen of our own generation, in America and elsewhere, who have had first-rate genius and have been favoured by fortune. It is true that a great part of these gains have come, in some cases, from the wrecks of the rival speculators who had been worsted in the race, but in others they were earned mainly by the supreme economizing force of a great constructive genius working at a new and large problem with a free hand. For instance, the founder of the Vanderbilt family, who evolved the New York Central Railroad system out of chaos, probably saved to the people of the United States more than he accumulated himself. Footnote. It should be noticed, however, that some of these gains may be traced to those opportunities for the formation of trade combinations engineered by a few able, wealthy, and daring men to exploit for their own benefit a great body of manufactures or the trade and traffic of a large district. That part of this power which depends on political conditions, and especially on the protective tariff, may pass away, but the area of America is so large, and its conditions so changeful, that the slow and steady-going management of a great joint stock company on the English plan is at a disadvantage in competition with the vigorous and original scheming, the rapid and resolute force of a small group of wealthy capitalists, who are willing and able to apply their own resources in great undertakings to a much greater extent than is the case in England. The ever-shifting conditions of business life in America enable natural selection to bring to the front the best minds for the purpose from their vast population, almost every one of whom, as he enters on life, resolves to be rich before he dies. The modern developments of business and of business fortunes are of exceptional interest and instruction to Englishmen, but their lessons will be misread unless the essentially different conditions of business life in the old world and the new are constantly borne in mind. End of footnote. But these fortunes are exceptional. The diffusion of education and prudent habits among the masses of the people, and the opportunities which the new methods of business offer for the safe investment of small capitals, are telling on the side of moderate incomes. The returns of the income tax and the house tax, the statistics of consumption of commodities, the records of salaries paid to the higher and the lower ranks of employees of government and public companies, all indicate that middle-class incomes are increasing faster than those of the rich, that the earnings of artisans are increasing faster than those of the professional classes, and that the wages of healthy and vigorous unskilled labourers are increasing faster even than those of the average artisan. The aggregate income of the very rich is perhaps not a larger part of the whole in England now than in earlier times, but in America, the aggregate value of land is rising fast. The higher strains of the working population are yielding ground to lower strains of immigrants, and great financiers are acquiring vast power. And it may possibly be true that the aggregate income from property is rising relatively to that from labour, and that the aggregate income of the very rich is rising fastest of all. It must be admitted that a rise in wages would lose part of its benefit if it were accompanied by an increase in the time spent in enforced idleness. Inconstancy of employment is a great evil, and rightly attracts public attention, but several causes combine to make it appear to be greater than it really is. When a large factory goes on half-time, rumour broots the news over the whole neighbourhood, and perhaps the newspapers spread it all over the country. But few people know when an independent workman or even a small employer gets only a few days' work in a month, and in consequence, whatever suspensions of industry there are in modern times are apt to seem more important than they are relatively to those of earlier times. In earlier times, some labourers were hired by the year, but they were not free and were kept to their work by personal chastisement. There is no good cause for thinking that the medieval artisan had constant employment, and the most persistently inconstant employment now to be found in Europe is in those non-agricultural industries of the West, which are most nearly medieval in their methods, and in those industries of Eastern and Southern Europe in which medieval traditions are strongest. Footnote. An instance which came under the present writer's observation may be mentioned here. In Palermo, there is a semi-feudal connection between the artisans and their patrons. Each carpenter or tailor has one or more large houses to which he looks for employment, and so long as he behaved himself fairly well, he was practically secure from competition. There are no great waves of depression of trade. The newspapers are never filled with accounts of the sufferings of those out of work, because their condition changes very little from time to time. But a larger percentage of artisans are out of employment at the best of times in Palermo than in England in the centre of the worst depression of recent years. End of footnote. In many directions, there is a steady increase in the proportion of employees who are practically hired by the year. This is, for instance, the general rule in many of those trades connected with transport which are growing fastest, and which are in some respects the representative industries of the second half of the 19th century, as the manufacturing trades were of the first half. And though the rapidity of invention, the fickleness of fashion, and above all the instability of credit, do certainly introduce disturbing elements into modern industry, yet, as we shall see presently, other influences are working strongly in the opposite direction, and there seems to be no good reason for thinking that inconstancy of employment is increasing on the whole. End of chapter 12.
Sections 1 to 8 of Chapter 8 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please...
Okay, that's a pretty good spot to end that. Alfred Marshall, spirit be gone. That's right. I'm closing this seance, and I'm sending you back to hell, where you belong, till I call ye forth again for our next little seance. Our next little black magic ritual, where I summon spirits and dance with demons. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, all right. So this is part 1 of public relations and economic perspective. Sure, people are thinking, well, what the hell does all that have to do with public relations? Well, a lot. It has a lot to do with public relations. You'll see what I'm talking about. Let's start off with talking about, let's define public relations. What is public relations? There are many different definitions of public relations. American historian Robert Heilbronner once described the field as a brotherhood of some 100,000 whose common bond is its profession and whose common woe is that no two of them can ever quite agree on what that profession is. In 1923, the late Edward Bernays described the function of his fledgling public relations counseling business as one of providing information given to the public, persuasion directed at the public to modify attitudes and actions of an institution with its publics and of publics with those of that institution. Okay, that's a little convoluted and confusing, but more on Edward Bernays a little bit later. He's an interesting character. Today, although a generally accepted definition of public relations still eludes practitioners, there is a clearer understanding of the field. One of the most ambitious searches for a universal definition was commissioned in 1975 by the Foundation for Public Relations Research and Education. 65 public relations leaders participated in the study, which analyzed 472 different definitions and offered the following 88-word sentence. And I quote, "Public relations is a distinct management function which helps establish and maintain mutual lines of communications, understanding, acceptance, and cooperation between an organization and its publics. Involves the management of problems or issues, helps management to keep informed on and responsive to public opinion, defines and emphasizes the responsibility of management to serve the public interest, helps management keep abreast of and effectively utilize change, serving as an early warning system to help anticipate trends and uses, research, and sound and ethical communication techniques as its principal tools." Okay. In 1988, the public, let me see here. I'm going to have to get crafty and sort of create a split screen here. Let's see. Okay. Oop. Okay, so in 1988, the Public Relations Society of America formally adopted the following definition of public relations, and quote, "Public relations helps an organization and its publics adapt mutually to each other," end quote. Okay, a lot of these definitions just really suck, okay? PR people are flim-flam hustlers, okay? Flim-flam snake oil, no, not snake oil salesman. Okay, but anyway. Okay, that's just, all right, anyway. Okay, so let's see here. The Public Relations Society noted that its definition, I swear I don't really, a lot of them, I guess a lot of them, they have that reputation, but we'll get more into that as well. I need to stop going off script here. By the way, when I say off script, reading the teleprompter and all that, I actually wrote this, so, I mean, I'm borrowing heavily from this guy, but, so I'm not completely plagiarizing or being a complete empty shell of a talking head. Once again, yeah, you want to check out that blog. That blog is charleslampson.blogspot.com. There's all kinds of useful info there on business administration, economics, finance, communications, organizational communications, marketing, public relations, all kinds of great stuff. So anyway, the Public Relations Society noted that its definition implied the functions of research, planning, communications, dialogue, and evaluation, all essential in the practice of public relations. No matter which formal definition one settles on to describe the practice, in order to be successful, public relations professionals must always engage in a planned process to influence the attitudes and actions of their targets. Let's see, it leads us to plan the process to influence public opinion. What is the process through which public relations might influence public opinion? Communications professor John Marston suggested a 4-step model based on specific functions. 1, research. 2, action. 3, communication. And 4, evaluation. Whenever a public relations professional is faced with an assignment, whether promoting a client's product or defending a client's reputation, he or she should apply Marston's RACE approach. That's RACE, which stands for research, action, communication, evaluation. Okay, research attitudes about the issue at hand. Action, identify action of the client in the public interest. Communication, communicate that action to gain understanding, acceptance, and support. Evaluation, evaluate the communication to see if opinion has been influenced. So the key to the process is the second step, action. You cannot have effective communication or positive publicity without proper action. Stated another way, performance must precede publicity. Act first and communicate later. Indeed, some might say that public relations, PR, really should stand for performance recognition. In other words, positive action communicated straightforwardly will yield positive results. This is the essence of the RACE process of public relations. Public relations professor Sheila Griffasi has proposed extending the RACE formula, RAC formula, into the 5-part ROSIE, ROSIE, to encompass a more managerial approach to the field. ROSIE, ROSIE, prescribes sandwiching the functions of objectives, strategies, and implementation between research and evaluation. Indeed, setting clear objectives, working from set strategies, and implementing a predetermined plan is a key to sound public relations practice. Still others suggest a process called RPIE for research, planning, implementation, and evaluation, which emphasizes the element of planning as a necessary step preceding the activation of a communications initiative. All three approaches, RACE, ROSIE, and RPIE, echo one of the most widely repeated definitions of public relations developed by the late Denny Griswold, who founded a public relations newsletter. Quote, public relations is the management function which evaluates public attitudes, identifies the policies and procedures of an individual or an organization with the public interest, and plans and executes a program of action to earn public understanding and acceptance. The key words in this definition are management and action. Public relations, if it is to serve the organization properly, must report to top management. Public relations must serve as an honest broker to management, unimpeded by any other group. For public relations to work, its advice to management must be unfiltered, uncensored, and unexpurgated. This is often easier said than done because many public relations departments report through marketing, advertising, or even legal departments. Nor can public relations take place without appropriate action. As noted, no amount of communications, regardless of its persuasive content, can save an organization whose performance is substandard. In other words, if the action is flawed or the performance rotten, no amount of communicating will change the reality. Stated another way, it is axiomatic in public relations that you can't pour perfume on a skunk or put lipstick on a pig. I guess that's another way to look at that. All right. I mean, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. The process of public relations, then, as Professor Melvin Sharp has put it, harmonizes long-term relationships among individuals and organizations in society. To harmonize, Professor Sharp applies 5 principles to the public relations process. 1, honest communication for credibility. 2, openness and consistency of actions for confidence. 3, fairness of actions for reciprocity and goodwill. 4, continuous two-way communication to prevent alienation and to build relationships. 5, environmental research and evaluation to determine the action or adjustments needed for social harmony. And if that doesn't if that doesn't give you a feel for what precisely the practice of public relations is, then consider public relations professor Janice Sherline Jennings' description as the management of communications between an organization and all entities that have a direct or indirect relationship with the organization, i.e., its publics. No matter what definition one may choose to explain the practice, few would argue that the goal of effective public relations is to harmonize internal and external relationships so that an organization can enjoy not only the goodwill of all its publics, but also stability and long life. Yeah, once again, there's going to be no call-in today. Just experiencing technical difficulties with the Blog Talk Radio right now. So, whoops. Well, what the heck is that? Okay. So, no call-in. But anyway, regardless. The growth of public relations. Okay, wait a minute. I want to go back here. And, okay, so once again, yeah, this is written. This is basically an analysis I did of a book I read and recently, and then I put on my blog, charleslanson.blogspot.com, and so yeah, I just want to give props where props are due. I mean, it was a good book. I don't know the guy, but it was a pretty good, informative book. I'm not gonna, give the guy too much shit, but it was kind of, I don't know, kind of like a little heavy on the propaganda. I think, but anyway, I tried to filter out as much of the propaganda as I could, and just because there was, a lot of I don't know, but there was a lot of good info in there that I think I tried to glean out the most important points without taking things too lightly and cracking jokes every 5 minutes, showing everyone, whatever. Whatever. I'm not going to sit here and shit on Fraser P. Seidel. I don't even know if he's still alive. But I don't know. He was a cohort of Rockefeller, so I don't know. And he, I guess he had his own practice in New York for a while, but I mean, you could tell he kind of, kissed up to the powers that be a lot. I guess, well, that's his business. But anyway, that's one good thing about being poor white trash. I don't have to suck up to anyone. All right, so I'm giving it to you straight. I'm giving you the straight dope, as I see it anyway. Okay, anyway, so the name of the book, I'm sorry, is The Practice of Public Relations, 10th ed, published in 2007, by Fraser P. Seidel, pages 4 to 6. Like I said, there was a lot of good stuff in there. I think I gleaned out the most important stuff. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the growth of public relations. Unlike accounting, economics, medicine, and law, public relations is still a young field, not even 100 years old. Whoa. Modern day public relations is clearly a 20th century phenomenon. I know what you're thinking. Oh, but all these other places did, practiced it in the past, kind of, sort of. And I'm gonna get into that. So anyway, okay. So the impetus for the growth of public relations, in fact, can be traced back to this man, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was widely attacked in 1914 when the coal company he owned in Ludlow, Colorado, was the scene of a bloody massacre staged by Colorado militiamen and company guards against evicted miners and their families. When a dozen women and small children were killed at the Ludlow massacre, one of those Rockefeller called in to help him deal with the crisis. Was a journalist named Ivy Ledbetter Lee. You may have heard that name before. Lee would go on to become the father of public relations. His employer, John D. Rockefeller, I guess there's a little debate there, whether it's him or Bernays, but I think this guy kind of comes at it from the perspective that Ivy Ledbetter Lee, I guess, kind of came. Okay. Anyway, so I guess he had a little bit more of a moral fiber, I don't know, or a moral compass, I guess, than Bernays. And so I guess that, I guess that's why he's saying he's the father of public relations. Some would say it's Bernays. But anyway, moving on, let's see here. So his employer, John D. Rockefeller Jr., whose own legendary father had always adhered to a strict policy of silence, would bear responsibility for the birth of a profession built on open communications. Ideally, it's supposed, it should be built on communications, but such is the nature of the beast. You got a lot of liars, spin doctors, and what have you. I guess Seidel and a lot of PR practitioners would argue, well, they're not really PR practitioners then if they're liars and swindlers, but I don't know. There's a lot of hypocrisy there. So that being said, let's move on. The relative youthfulness of the practice of public relations means that the field is still evolving. It is also improving every day. Okay, this Seidel's words. I guess ideally, that's the direction we want to move in as public relations practitioners. We want to be ministers of truth, but ideally, we'll talk more about that coming up. The professionals entering the practice today are by and large superior in intellect, training, and even experience to their counterparts of decades ago. The strength of the public relations, the strength of the practice of public relations today is based on the enduring commitment of the public to participate in a free and open democratic society. At least 5 trends are related to the evolution of public relations. You got 1, the growth of big institutions. The days of the mom and pop grocery store, the tiny community college, and the small bank are rapidly disappearing. In their place have emerged Walmarts, Home Depots, and Citigroups, statewide community college systems, and nationwide banking networks. The public relations profession has evolved to interpret these large institutions to the publics they serve. 2, heightened public awareness and media sophistication. First came the invention of the printing press. Then came mass communications, the print media, radio, and television. Later, it was the development of cable, satellite, videotape, video discs, video typewriters, portable cameras, word processors, fax machines, cell phones, the internet, blogs, podcasts, vlogs, vlogs, and all the other communications technology that have helped fragment audiences. In the 1960s, McGill University professor Marshall McLuhan predicted the world would become a global village, where people everywhere could witness events no matter where they occurred in real time. In the 21st century, McLuhan's prophecy has become a reality. 3, increasing incidence of societal change, conflict, and confrontation. Minority rights, women's rights, senior citizens' rights, gay rights, consumerism, environmental awareness, downsizings, layoffs, and resultant unhappiness with large institutions all have become part of day-to-day society. With the growth of the web, activists have become increasingly more daring, visible, and effective. 4, growing power of global media, public opinion, and democracy. The outbreak of democracy in Latin America, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South Africa, and in the 21st century, Afghanistan and Iraq, has heightened the power of public opinion around the world. The process has been energized by print and electronic media that span the globe. Public opinion is a powerful force, not only in democracies like the United States, but also for oppressed peoples around the world. Accordingly, the practice of public relations as a facilitator for understanding has increased in prominence. 5, dominance of the internet. In 2015, the International Telecommunication Union estimated about 3.2 billion people, or almost half of the world's population, would be online by the end of the year. Of them, about 2 billion people would be from developing countries, including 89 million from least developed countries. The extraordinary growth of the internet and the World Wide Web has made billions of people around the world instant consumers of unlimited communication. The profound change this continues to bring to society is monumental. Ancient beginnings. Although modern public relations is a 20th century phenomenon, its roots are ancient. Leaders in every great society throughout history understood the importance of influencing public opinion through persuasion. For example, archaeologists have found bulletins in Iraq dating from as early as 1800 BC that told farmers of the latest techniques of harvesting, sowing, and irrigating. The more food the farmers grew, the better the citizenry ate, and the wealthier the country became. A good example of planned persuasion to reach a specific public for a particular purpose. In other words, public relations. The ancient Greeks also put a high premium on communication skills. The best speakers, in fact, were generally elected to leadership positions. Occasionally, aspiring Greek politicians enlisted the aid of sophists, individuals renowned for both their reasoning and their rhetoric, to help fight verbal battles. Sophists gathered in the amphitheaters of the day to extol the virtues of particular political candidates. Thus, the sophists set the stage for today's lobbyists, who attempt to influence legislature through effective communication techniques. From the time of sophists, the practice of public relations has been a battleground for questions of ethics. Should a sophist or a lobbyist, or a public relations professional for that matter, sell his or her talents to the highest bidder, regardless of personal beliefs, values, and ideologies? When modern-day public relations professionals agree to represent repressive governments or to defend the questionable actions of troubled celebrities, these ethical questions remain very much a focus of modern public relations. The Romans, particularly Julius Caesar, were also masters of persuasive techniques. When faced with an upcoming battle, Caesar would rally public support through published pamphlets and staged events. Similarly, during World War I, a special U.S. Public Information Committee, the Creel Committee, was formed to channel the patriot sentiments of Americans in support of the U.S. role in the war. Stealing a page from Caesar, the committee's massive verbal and written communications effort was successful in marshaling national pride behind the war effort. According to a young member of the Creel Committee, Edward L. Bernays, later considered by many to be the father of public relations as well. So once again, there's that rivalry I was talking about between Bernays people and the Ledbetter Lee people. But anyway, this quote from Edward Bernays, who was working for the Creel Committee during World War I. This was the first time in U.S. history that information was used as a weapon of war. That's just not even true at all. But you know, Bernays he was a character. He liked to do a lot of, he's constantly pumping the practice of public relations. He's always trying to, add an air of credibility to it, whereas, kind of has a bad reputation. But hey, he was out there, trying to make people take it more seriously, he was trying. So I don't know. He was definitely a strange character, Bernays. But okay, so even the Catholic Church had a hand in the creation of public relations in the 1600s under the leadership of Pope Gregory XV. The church established a college of propaganda to help propagate the faith. So once again, I just got to take issue with what Seidel was saying. This is not I guess the modern practice of public relations, I guess, is fairly new, but governments have always had propaganda, so I'm not quite sure what he was getting at. It's not. I guess it hasn't been it's been called public relations very, very long, I guess, relatively speaking. I guess maybe that's what he meant. I don't know. But I felt it important to write down, I guess, just because, like I said, I guess there is kind of a difference between the modern practice of, well, a big difference between the modern practice of, say, public relations. Well, anyway, moving on. Okay, let's see here. Right, so today the Pope and other religious, I want to take this from the top. Even the Catholic Church had a hand in the creation of public relations in the 1600s. Under the leadership of Pope Gregory XV, the Church established a college of propaganda to help propagate the faith. In those days, the term propaganda did not have a negative connotation. The Church simply wanted to inform the public about the advantages of Catholicism. Today, the Pope and other religious leaders maintain communication staffs to assist in relations with the public. Indeed, the chief communications official in the Vatican maintains the rank of Archbishop of the Church. It is largely his role to deal with perhaps the biggest scandal ever to face the Catholic Church, and that is the ongoing priest pedophile issue. So, early American experience. I guess it's open for debate how well that's actually being handled. So, okay, I think at this point they're basically saying, "Hey, this is what we do. We're Catholic. We're Catholic priests. If you're dumb enough to send your kids to our schools, well, hey, our churches, then you must be into it, man." Okay, anyway, early American experience. The American public relations experience dates back to the founding of the Republic. Influencing public opinion, managing communications, and persuading individuals at the highest levels were at the core of the American Revolution. The colonists tried to persuade King George III that they should be accorded the same rights as Englishmen. Taxation without representation is tyranny, because their public relations slogan to galvanize fellow countrymen. When King George refused to accede to the colonists' demands, they combined the weaponry of sword and pen. Samuel Adams, for one, organized committees of correspondence as a kind of revolutionary Associated Press to disseminate anti-British information throughout the colonies. He also staged events to build up revolutionary fervor, such as the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists masquerading as Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and pitched chests of imported tea overboard. As impressive a media event as has ever been recorded, sans television. Thomas Paine, another early practitioner of public relations, wrote periodic pamphlets and essays that urged the colonists to band together. In one essay contained in his Crisis Papers, Paine wrote poetically, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. The people listened, were persuaded, and took action, testifying to the power of early American communicators." Moving on. Okay. Here we go. Okay, later American experience, the creation of the most important document in our nation's history, the Constitution, owed much to public relations. Federalists who supported the Constitution fought tooth and nail with anti-federalists who opposed it. Their battle was waged in newspaper articles, pamphlets, and other organs of persuasion in an attempt to influence public opinion. To advocate ratification of the Constitution, political leaders such as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay banded together under the pseudonym Publius to write letters to leading newspapers. Today, those letters are bound in a document called the Federalist Papers and are still used in the interpretation of the Constitution. After its ratification, the constitutional debate continued, particularly over the document's apparent failure to protect individual liberties against government encroachment. Hailed as the father of the Constitution, Madison framed the Bill of Rights in 1791, which ultimately became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Fittingly, the first of those amendments safeguarded, among other things, the practice of public relations. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the rights of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. In other words, people were given the right to speak up for what they believed in, and the freedom to try to influence the opinions of others. Thus was the practice of public relations ratified. Into the 1800s, the practice of public relations continued to percolate in the 19th century. Among the more prominent yet negative antecedents of modern public relations that took hold in the 1800s was press agentry. Two of the better known, some would say notorious practitioners of this art were Amos Kendall and Phineas T. Barnum, P.T. Barnum. In 1829, President Andrew Jackson selected Kendall, a Kentucky writer and editor, to serve in his administration. Within weeks, Kendall became a member of Old Hickory's kitchen cabinet and eventually became one of Jackson's most influential assistants. Kendall performed just about every White House public relations task. He wrote speeches, state papers, and messages, and turned out press releases. He even conducted basic opinion polls and is considered one of the earliest users of the newsleak. Although Kendall is generally credited with being the first authentic presidential press secretary, his functions and role went far beyond that position. Among Kendall's most successful ventures in Jackson's behalf was the development of the administration's own newspaper, The Globe. Although it was not uncommon for the governing administration to publish its own national house organ, Kendall's deft editorial touch refined the process to increase its effectiveness. Kendall would pen a Jackson news release, distribute it for publication to a local newspaper, and then reprint the press clipping in the Globe to underscore Jackson's nationwide popularity. Indeed, that popularity continued, unabated, throughout Jackson's years in office, with much of the credit going to the president's public relations advisor. Most public relations professionals would rather not talk about P.T. Barnum as an industry pioneer. Barnum, some say, was a huckster, whose motto might well have been, "The public be fooled." Barnum's defenders suggest that although the impresario may have had his faults, he nonetheless was respected in his time as a user of written and verbal public relations techniques to further his museum and circus. Like him or not, Barnum was a master publicist. In the 1800s, as owner of a major circus, Barnum generated article after article for his traveling show. He purposely gave his star performers short names, for instance, Tom Thumb, the midget, and Jenny Lind, the singer, so that they could easily fit into the headlines of narrow newspaper columns. Barnum also staged bizarre events, such as the legal marriage of the fat lady to the thin man, free newspaper exposure. And although today's practitioners scoff at Barnum's methods, some press agents still practice his techniques. Nevertheless, when today's public relations professionals bemoan the specter of shysters and hucksters that still overhangs their field, they inevitably place the blame squarely on the fertile mind and silver tongue of P.T. Barnum. Emergence of the robber barons. The American Industrial Revolution ushered in many things at the turn of the century, not the least of which was the growth of public relations, giving way to massive factories, eventually giving way to massive factories. Country hamlets, which had been the center of commerce and trade, were replaced by sprawling cities. Limited transportation and communications facilities became nationwide railroad lines and communications wires. Big business took over, and the businessman was king. The men who ran America's industries seemed more concerned with making a profit than with improving the lot of their fellow citizens. Railroad owners, led by William Vanderbilt, bankers, led by J.P. Morgan, oil magnates, led by John D. Rockefeller, and steel impresarios, led by Henry Clay Frick, ruled the fortunes of thousands of others. Typical of the reputation acquired by this group of industrialists was the famous and perhaps apocryphal response of Vanderbilt when questioned about the public's reaction to his closing of the New York Central Railroad. "The public be damned." Well, that son of a bitch. Little wonder that Americans cursed Vanderbilt and his ilk as robber barons who cared little for the rest of society. Light's burning my eyeballs, burning holes in my retinas. Although most who depended on these industrialists for their livelihood felt powerless to rebel, the seeds of discontent were being sown liberally throughout society. Enter the Muckrakers. When the axe fell on the robber barons, it came in the form of criticism from a feisty group of journalists dubbed Muckrakers. The muck that these reporters and editors raked was dredged from the supposedly scandalous operations of America's business enterprises. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, attacked the deplorable conditions of the meatpacking industry. Ida Tarbell's history of the Standard Oil Company stripped away the public facade of the nation's leading petroleum firm. Her accusations against Standard Oil chairman Rockefeller, many of which were unproven, nonetheless stirred up public attention. This guy is a mouthpiece for but it's kind of a mouthpiece for the Rockefeller family, Fraser P. Seidel, so he knows where his bread is buttered. So anyway, once again, I don't even know if he's still alive, to be honest, but anyway. Can you lighten up on the propaganda a little bit, please? Don't need to put that shit in the okay, anyway. Yes, it is. Hey, what do you want? It's a college textbook, all right? So still letting a little bit of the propaganda sneak through. Like I said, I thought I gleaned all that out of there, but I guess I didn't glean it good enough. Okay, so anyway, as journalists and the public became more anxious, the government got more involved. Congress began passing laws telling, oh, shoot. Magazines such as McClure's struck out systematically at one industry after another. The captains of industry, used to getting their own way and having to answer to no one, were wrenched from their peaceful passivity and rolled out on the public carpet to answer for their sins. Journalistic shock stories soon led to a wave of sentiment for legislative reform. As journalists and the public became more anxious, the government got more involved. Congress began passing laws telling business leaders what they could and could not do. Trust busting became the order of the day. Conflicts between employers and employees began to break out, and newly organized labor unions came to the fore. The socialist and communist movements began to take off. Ironically, it was a period when free enterprise reached a peak in American history. And yet at that very climax, the tide of public opinion was swelling up against business freedom, primarily because of the breakdown in communications between the businessman and the public. So, for a time, these men of inordinate wealth and power found themselves limited in their ability to defend themselves and their activities against the tidal wave of public condemnation. They simply did not know how to get through to the public to tell their side of the story. The business barons first tried using the lure of advertising to silence journalistic critics. They tried to pay off critics by paying for ads in their papers. It didn't work. Next, they paid publicity people or press agents to present their company's positions. Often these hired guns painted over the real problem of their client companies. The public saw through this approach. Clearly, another method had to be discovered to get the public to at least consider the business point of view. Business leaders were discovering that a corporation might have capital, labor, and natural resources, yet be doomed to fail if it could not influence public opinion. The best way to influence public opinion, as it turned out, was through honesty and candor. This simple truth was the key to the accomplishments of American history's first great public relations counselor, Ivy Lee, the real father of modern public relations. Okay. That is Fraser P. Seidel's contention. Ivy Ledbetter Lee was a former Wall Street reporter, the son of a Methodist minister who plunged into publicity work in 1903. Lee believed neither in Barnum's public be fooled approach nor Vanderbilt's public be damned philosophy. For Lee, the key to business acceptance and understanding was that the public be informed. Father of public relations, Ivy Lee, according to Fraser P. Seidel. I guess he's not a huge fan of Bernays. But you can't discount Bernays' effectiveness. That's for damn sure. Okay. His moral compass might have been a little eccentric or different than most people's, but as far as effectiveness goes, guy's a damn genius. So Lee disdained the press agents of the time. Okay, so let's talk about Lee, though. Ivy Lee. Lee disdained the press agents of the time who used any influence or trick to get a story on their clients printed, regardless of the truth or merits. By contrast, Lee firmly believed that the only way business could answer its critics convincingly was to present its side honestly, accurately, and forcefully. Instead of merely appeasing the public, Lee thought a company should strive to earn public confidence and goodwill. In 1914, John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of the nation's most maligned and misunderstood men, hired son of most. Okay, once again, that's just laying on. He's laying it on a little thick there. I can't even believe I included that. John D. Rockefeller, son of one of the nation's most maligned and misunderstood men. Maybe he was maligned and misunderstood. I don't know. Haters gotta hate, right? So, anyway, hired Lee to assist. I mean, I've been the victim myself of haters, people spreading bullshit just because they're jealous for whatever reason. You know, you're probably looking at me and like, who in the fuck is jealous of you, Charles? But there's a couple people are jealous of me. So, all right. Let's see here. So, okay, take it from the top. In 1914, John Rockefeller Jr., son of one of the nation's most maligned and misunderstood men, hired Lee to assist with the fallout from the Ludlow massacre affecting his Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Lee's advice to Rockefeller was simple, and I quote, "Tell the truth, because sooner or later the public will find out anyway. And if the public doesn't like what you're doing, change your policies and bring them into line with what the people want." End quote. So, despite the tragedy of Ludlow, Lee encouraged Rockefeller to create a joint labor management board to mediate all workers' grievances on wages, hours, and working conditions. It was a great success. The mine workers and the public began to see John D. Rockefeller Jr. in a different light. Recalled nearly a century later, my father was changed profoundly by his meeting with the workers. It was a lesson that stayed with him throughout the rest of his life and one of the most important things that ever happened to our family. Rockefeller's youngest son, David, called nearly a century later. All right, so in working for the Rockefellers, Lee tried to humanize them, to feature them in real-life situations such as playing golf, attending church, and celebrating birthdays. Simply, Lee's goal was to present the Rockefellers in terms that every individual could understand and appreciate. Ironically, even Ivy Lee could not escape the glare of public criticism. In the late 1920s, Lee was asked to serve as an advisor to the parent company of the German Die Trust, which, as it turned out, was an agent for the policies of Adolf Hitler. Oops. Okay, so anyway, for his involvement with the Die Trust, Lee was branded a traitor and dubbed Poison Ivy by members of Congress investigating un-American activities. Ironically, the smears against him in the press rivaled the most vicious ones against any of the robber barons. Yep. Despite his unfortunate involvement with the Die Trust, Ivy Lee is recognized as the individual who began to distinguish publicity and press agentry from public relations based on honesty and candor. For his seminal contributions to the field, Ivy Lee should be considered the real father of the real father of public relations, according to you, Fraser P. Seidel. Like I said, a lot of people would disagree with that. Oh, shoot. Which a lot of people think it was Bernays. Okay, which I think we're going to talk about here in this next section. Yep. Okay. Where are we? Oh, wow. So, the growth of modern public relations. Ivy Lee helped to open the gate for modern public relations after he established the idea that high-powered companies and individuals have a responsibility to inform their publics. The practice began to grow in every sector of American society. Government. During World War I, President Woodrow Wilson established the Creel Committee under the leadership of journalist George Creel. Creel's group, composed of the nation's leading journalists, scholars, and public relations leaders, mounted an impressive effort to mobilize public opinion in support of the war effort and to stimulate the sale of war bonds through Liberty Loan publicity drives. Not only did the war effort get a boost, but so did the field of public relations. The nation was mightily impressed with the potential power of publicity as a weapon to encourage national sentiment and support. During World War II, the public relations field received an even bigger boost. The Office of War Information, OWI, was established to convey the message of the United States at home and abroad under the direction of Elmer Davis, a veteran journalist. The OWI laid the foundation for the U.S. Information Agency as America's voice around the world. World War II also saw a flurry of activity to sell war bonds, boost the morale of those at home, spur production in the nation's factories and offices, and, in general, support America's war effort as intensively as possible. By virtually every measure, this full-court public relations offensive was an unquestioned success. The proliferation of public relations officers in World War I led to a growth in the number of practitioners during the peace that followed. One reason companies saw the need to have public relations professionals to speak up for them was the more combative attitude of President Harry Truman toward many of the country's largest institutions. For example, Truman's seizure of the steel mills touched off a massive public relations campaign, the likes of which had rarely been seen outside the government. Later in the century, the communications problems of President Richard Nixon surrounding the cover-up of the Watergate political scandal brought new criticism of public relations. But the subsequent administration of the great communicator Ronald Reagan reaffirmed the value of public relations. Counseling. The nation's first public relations firm, the Publicity Bureau, was founded in Boston in 1900 and specialized in general press agentry. The first Washington, D.C. agency was begun in 1902 by William Wolfe Smith, a former correspondent for the New York Sun and the Cincinnati Enquirer. 2 years later, Ivy Lee joined with a partner to begin his own counseling firm. The most significant counselor this side of Ivy Lee, Edward L. Bernays, was Edward L. Bernays, who began as a publicist in 1913. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud and author of the landmark book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. Bernays was a giant in the public relations field for nearly the entire century. In addition to contributing as much to the field as any other professional in its history, Bernays was a true public relations scholar. He taught the first course in public relations in 1923 and was also responsible for recruiting the field's first distinguished female practitioner, his wife, Doris E. Fleischman. Fleischman, former editor of the New York Tribune, was a skilled writer, and her husband was a skilled strategist and promoter. Together, they built Edward L. Bernays' Council on Public Relations into a top agency in many ways. Fleischman was the mother of public relations, paving the way for a field that is today dominated by talented women. Bernays' seminal writings in the field underscored the importance of strategic communications advice for clients. For example, Bernays wrote, quote, "At first, we called our activity publicity direction. We intended to give advice to clients on how to direct their actions to get public visibility for them. But within a year, we changed the service and its name to Council on Public Relations. We recognized that all actions of a client that impinged on the public needed counsel. Public visibility of a client for one action might be vitiated by another action not in the public interest. End quote. After Bernays' pioneering counseling efforts, a number of public relations firms, most headquartered in New York, began to take root. Most notably, among them Hill and Knowlton, Carl Bayor, and Associates, Newsom and Company, and Burston Marsteller. One of the earliest African-American counselors was D. Park Gibson, who authored 2 books on African-American consumerism and advised companies on multicultural relations. For many years, Hill and Knowlton and Burston Marsteller jockeyed for leadership position in the counseling industry. One early counselor, Harold Burson, emphasized marketing-oriented public relations to help clients sell their goods and services, maintain a favorable market for their stock, and foster harmonious relations with employees. In the 1990s, the counseling business saw the emergence of international super agencies, many of which were merged into advertising agencies. Indeed, both Hill and Knowlton and Burston Marsteller were eventually merged under one corporation, WPP, which also includes the J. Walter Thompson and Young and Rubicam advertising agencies. Another mega communications firm, Omnicom Group, owns 7 major public conglomerates. Omnicom Group owned 7 major public relations firms, including Fleischman Hillard, Porter Novelli, and Ketchum. Despite these communications conglomerates, most public relations agencies still operate as independent entities. In the 21st century, then, the public relations counseling business boasts a diverse mix of huge national agencies, medium-sized regional firms, and one-person local operations. Public relations agencies may be general in nature or specialists in everything from consumer products to entertainment to healthcare to technology. Corporations. As the 20th century rolled on, the perceptual problems of corporations and their leaders diminished. Opinion polls after World War II ranked business as high in public esteem. People were back at work and business was back in style. Smart companies, General Electric, General Motors, and American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, for example, worked hard to preserve their good names through both words and actions. Arthur W. Page became AT&T's first public relations vice president in 1927. Page was a legendary public relations figure, helping to maintain AT&T's reputation as a prudent and proper corporate citizen. Page also was one of the few public relations executives to serve on prestigious corporate boards of directors, including Chase Manhattan Bank, Kennecott Copper, Prudential Insurance, and Westinghouse Electric. Page's 5 principles of successful corporate public relations are as relevant now as they were in the 1930s. 1. To make sure management thoughtfully analyzes its overall relation to the public. 2. To create a system for informing all employees about the firm's general policies and practices. 3. To create a system giving contact employees, those having direct dealings with the public, the knowledge needed to be reasonable and polite to the public. 4. To create a system drawing employee and public questions and criticism back up through the organization to management. 5. To ensure frankness in telling the public about the company's actions. Another early corporate public relations luminary was Paul Garrett, a former news reporter. He became the first director of public relations for General Motors in 1931. working directly for GM's legendary CEO, Alfred Sloan. Garrett once reportedly explained that the essence of his job was to convince the public that the powerful auto company deserved trust. That is, quote, to make a billion-dollar company seem small, end quote. Ironically, as good as Garrett was, he nevertheless reflected the universal public relations complaint still coming today of never feeling like an insider within his organization. All right, so end of the big show. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Have a good night, everybody.